Sometimes keeping your word to one person means breaking your promise to another. And Thaddeus Bear Mallister was about to discover that some choices don't have right answers, only bloody consequences. Hook 1. What would you do if saving one life could spark a war that destroys everything you've built? Stay tuned to Narrative Sphere to find out. It had been 6 months since Bear's Ranch became neutral ground between the Comanche and white settlers. 6 months of careful peace, respected boundaries, and the kind of quiet that makes a man think he's finally figured out how to live right. But peace in Texas has always been as fragile as morning frost, and this particular October morning was about to shatter everything Bear thought he'd built. Bear was splitting firewood behind his cabin when he heard the gunshots, distant but unmistakable, coming from the direction of Devil's Canyon, about 2 miles north. 3 quick shots, then silence, then 2 more. That wasn't hunting. That was trouble, and it was heading his way. He set down his axe and listened carefully. The sound of hoofbeats followed, irregular and desperate, like a horse being pushed beyond its limits. Bear had heard that rhythm before. Someone running for their life and losing ground fast. Through the morning haze, a figure emerged from the canyon mouth, bent low over a paint horse that was clearly exhausted. Even from a distance, Bear could see the rider's dark hair streaming behind him and the traditional Comanche clothing that marked him as one of White Bull's people. But something was wrong. The way the young man swayed in the saddle, the dark stains on his shirt that could only be blood. Bear's stomach dropped as he recognized the rider, Swift Eagle, the 19-year-old son of Running Wolf, one of White Bull's most trusted warriors. The boy had been to Bear's Ranch twice before, as part of peaceful trading parties, always respectful, always curious about the white man's ways of farming and animal husbandry. Now Swift Eagle was riding like death itself was chasing him, and from the sound of those pursuing hoofbeats getting closer, Bear realized that wasn't far from the truth. The young Comanche made it to Bear's fence line before his horse finally gave out, collapsing to its knees and rolling onto its side, breathing in great heaving gasps. Swift Eagle tumbled from the saddle and tried to stand, but his legs buckled immediately. Bear could see now that the blood wasn't just on his shirt. It was everywhere, seeping from what looked like a bullet wound in his shoulder and another in his thigh. Bear ran toward the fallen warrior, but Swift Eagle's hand went immediately to the knife at his belt. His eyes wild with pain and fear. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, words Bear couldn't understand, but the desperation was universal. "Easy, son," Bear said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm going to help you." Swift Eagle's eyes focused on Bear's face, recognition flickering through the haze of pain. He spoke again, this time in broken English. "Soldiers, they come. You must not, cannot help me." The sound of pursuing horses was getting louder now. Maybe 5 minutes away at most, Bear could hear voices shouting orders. The jingle of cavalry equipment, the kind of organized pursuit that meant official military business. "Why are they chasing you?" Bear asked. But Swift Eagle was already losing consciousness, his head lolling to one side as blood loss took its toll. Hook 2. A dying warrior, a cavalry closing in, and a choice that could ignite a war. Can Bear find a way to save Swift Eagle without betraying everything he stands for? Keep watching Narrative Sphere to see how this unfolds. Bear faced an impossible choice. By the treaty arrangements he'd helped negotiate, his ranch was supposed to be neutral ground, a place where neither Comanche nor white settlers could pursue their conflicts. But that neutrality had never been tested like this. If he helped Swift Eagle, he'd be harboring a fugitive from the US cavalry. If he turned the boy over, he'd be betraying the trust of White Bull's people and possibly sending a 19-year-old to his death. The hoofbeats were close enough now that Bear could make out individual horses, maybe 8 or 10 riders, moving fast and with purpose. In less than 3 minutes, they'd crest the ridge and see everything. Swift Eagle bleeding in Bear's yard, the exhausted horse, the decision that Bear was about to make. Swift Eagle's eyes opened one more time, and he gripped Bear's shirt with surprising strength. For someone losing so much blood, sacred law, he whispered. If you help me live, you break sacred law. My father, he will have to kill you. Bear's blood went cold. He'd never heard of this law, but the terror in Swift Eagle's eyes told him it was real and deadly serious. But there was no time to think, no time to weigh consequences. The cavalry was almost here, and a 19-year-old boy was bleeding to death in front of him. Bear made the only choice his conscience would allow, the same choice that had gotten him into this situation 6 months ago. He scooped Swift Eagle into his arms and ran toward his cabin, the young warrior's blood soaking through both their shirts. Behind them, the sound of cavalry horses grew louder, and Bear realized he'd just made a decision that would either save 2 lives or destroy them both. Bear barely got Swift Eagle inside before the cavalry thundered into his yard, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that settled like a curtain over what was about to become the most dangerous conversation of Bear's life. Through his window, Bear watched as 10 blue-uniformed soldiers spread out in a practice formation around his cabin. At their head rode a man Bear had never seen before. Tall, lean, with lieutenant's bars on his collar, and the kind of cold eyes that had seen too much war and enjoyed it too much. Bear quickly moved Swift Eagle to his bedroom, laying the unconscious warrior on his own bed and covering him with blankets. The blood was still seeping through the bandages Bear had hastily applied, but at least the young man was breathing steadily. A sharp knock rattled Bear's front door, followed immediately by a voice that brooked no argument. "Open up! This is Lieutenant Marcus Steele, United States Cavalry." Bear took a deep breath, wiped the blood from his hands as best he could, and opened the door. Lieutenant Steele stood on his porch, with one hand resting casually on his sidearm, his pale blue eyes scanning Bear's face for any sign of deception. "Afternoon, mister," Steele said, though his tone made it clear this wasn't a social call. "Mallister, Thaddeus Mallister. What can I do for you, Lieutenant?" "We're pursuing a Comanche warrior who murdered 2 of my men this morning. Witnesses saw him riding in this direction." Steele stepped closer, close enough that Bear could smell the tobacco on his breath. "You wouldn't happen to have seen anything unusual, would you?" Bear's mind raced. He could hear Swift Eagle's labored breathing from the bedroom, and he was acutely aware of the blood stains on his shirt that he tried to hide by keeping his arms crossed. "I heard some gunshots earlier, maybe an hour ago. Sounded like they came from up near Devil's Canyon. That's where we lost his trail," one of the other soldiers called out. "A horse tracks led right down toward this ranch." Steele's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we take a look around your property, Mr. Mallister, just to be thorough?" Every instinct in Bear's body screamed. Danger! If they found Swift Eagle, the boy would be dead within the hour, either shot while resisting arrest or strung up from the nearest tree. But if Bear refused the search, they'd know he was hiding something. "Of course," Bear said, stepping aside. "Though I should mention this ranch is supposed to be neutral ground under the agreement I have with Chief White Bull. I'm not sure your commanding officer would appreciate." "My commanding officer," Steele interrupted, "is Colonel Harrison, and he's the one who sent us after this particular savage. You see, the Comanche we're hunting didn't just kill 2 soldiers. He killed them while they were escorting a supply wagon to the reservation, a wagon full of medicine and food for Comanche children." Bear felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. If that was true, then Swift Eagle wasn't just a fugitive. He was a murderer who had stolen from his own people's children. But something about Steele's story didn't feel right. Something in the way the lieutenant's eyes didn't quite meet his when he told it. That's hard to believe," Bear said carefully. "The Comanche I've met wouldn't what?" Steele's voice turned hard. Wouldn't butcher two good men who were trying to help them? Wouldn't steal medicine from their own children? He gestured to his men. Spread out, boys. Check every building, every hiding spot. And remember, this savage is wounded and dangerous. Bear watched helplessly as the soldiers began their search, starting with his barn and working their way systematically toward the cabin. He had maybe 10 minutes before they reached the bedroom, where Swift Eagle lay unconscious. That's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the soldiers was carrying a distinctive leather pouch, Comanche-made, with the same intricate beadwork he'd seen on White Bull's daughter 6 months ago. But this pouch had dark stains on it that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Sergeant Morrison," Steele called out, and Bear realized with horror that this was the son of Deputy Morrison from town, a young man Bear had known since he was a child. "Show Mr. Mallister what we found at the scene." Morrison reluctantly held up the pouch. This belonged to one of the dead soldiers, had his personal effects in it, letters from home, a photograph of his wife. Morrison's voice was tight with emotion. The savage took it as a trophy. Bear stared at the pouch, his mind working furiously. Something was wrong with this picture. In all his dealings with the Comanche, he'd never known them to take such personal trophies. They might take weapons or horses, but intimate belongings like letters and photographs, that went against everything he understood about their honor code. "May I see it?" Bear asked. Steele hesitated, then nodded to Morrison, who handed over the pouch. Bear examined it carefully, noting the craftsmanship, the specific pattern of the beadwork. He'd seen enough Comanche artistry to recognize different tribal signatures. And this pouch wasn't made by White Bull's people. The pattern was wrong. The colors were wrong. Everything about it was wrong. "This wasn't made by anyone from White Bull's tribe," Bear said carefully. "The beadwork pattern is all wrong. Are you calling me a liar?" Steele's hand moved back to his sidearm. "I'm saying there might be more to this story than—" A crash came from inside the cabin as one of the soldiers knocked something over in Bear's kitchen. Then came a shout, "Lieutenant, I found something!" Bear's heart stopped. They'd found Swift Eagle. But when the soldier emerged from the cabin, he wasn't dragging an unconscious Comanche warrior. Instead, he was holding a blood-soaked shirt, Swift Eagle's shirt, which Bear had cut away to tend to his wounds. "Fresh blood, sir," the soldier reported. "Still wet, and there's more in the bedroom. Looks like someone was doctoring wounds." Steele turned to Bear with a smile that was colder than a winter grave. Well, Mr. Mallister, it seems your neutrality isn't quite as neutral as you claimed." Bear realized with growing horror that he'd just walked into a trap that was about to cost not just his life, but Swift Eagle's as well, and somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard the sound of war drums beginning to beat. Bear raised his hands slowly, his mind racing for any explanation that might save Eagle's life. "That blood is mine, Lieutenant. I cut myself splitting wood this morning. Caught my hand on a splinter." Steele examined Bear's hands with the thoroughness of a man who'd caught plenty of liars. "Funny thing about blood, Mallister. Fresh blood is bright red. Old blood turns brown." He held up the shirt. "This blood is still red as a rose." The other soldiers had formed a loose circle around Bear now, their rifles casually pointed in his direction. Not quite aimed, but close enough to send a clear message. "Search the cabin again," Steele ordered. "Every room, every closet, every place a wounded savage might hide. And this time, move the furniture." Bear felt sweat beading on his forehead. Despite the cool October air, Swift Eagle was hidden under blankets in the bedroom, but he was unconscious and still bleeding. If the soldiers moved the bed or pulled back those covers— "Lieutenant," Sergeant Morrison said quietly, "maybe we should send word back to Colonel Harrison before we—" "Before we what, Sergeant?" Steele's voice carried a dangerous edge. Before we arrest a man who's harboring a murderer, before we complete the mission we were sent to accomplish, Morrison shifted uncomfortably. It's just that Mr. Mallister here has an agreement with the tribes. If we violate that without proper authorization, the only authorization I need, Steele interrupted, is 2 dead soldiers and a trail of blood leading to this ranch. He turned back to Bear. You've got one chance to tell me the truth, Mallister. Where is he? Bear looked into Steele's cold eyes and realized that the truth wouldn't matter to this man. Whether Swift Eagle was guilty or innocent, whether he'd killed those soldiers or been framed, Steele had already decided how this story was going to end. I don't know what you're talking about, Bear said. Steele nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. Sergeant Morrison, take 3 men and start with the bedroom. If you find what I think you're going to find, we'll be holding a trial right here in this yard. Bear's blood went cold. A trial? That's right. Judge, jury, and executioner. All nice and legal-like. Steele's smile was like a knife blade. The penalty for harboring a murderer is death, Mr. Mallister. And the penalty for murdering soldiers is a rope around the neck. That's when Bear heard it. A sound that made every man in the yard freeze where they stood. War drums, distant but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the hills. The slow, steady rhythm that meant the Comanche were mobilizing for something big. Morrison went pale. Lieutenant, if those drums mean what I think they mean nothing, Steele snapped. But Bear could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes for the first time. White Bull's people won't risk open war over one renegade warrior. But Bear knew better. Those drums weren't just signaling a war party. They were announcing that Running Wolf, Swift Eagle's father, had discovered his son was missing. And if Running Wolf thought the cavalry had killed his boy, the drums grew louder. And now Bear could make out a second rhythm, joining the first. Then a third. 3 different tribes, all beating war drums at the same time. That hadn't happened in Bear's memory. Steele's confidence was beginning to crack. How many warriors does White Bull command? He asked Bear. On a good day, maybe 300. Bear paused, listening to the drums. But if he's allied with the other chiefs, you're looking at close to 1,000. One of Steele's soldiers swore under his breath. Another started checking his ammunition. They won't attack soldiers, Steele said. But his voice lacked conviction. They will if they think you murdered one of their children. Bear replied. And right now, that's exactly what they think. The drums stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. In that silence, Bear could hear something that made his heart sink. The sound of many horses moving fast across the prairie, heading directly for his ranch. Swift Eagle's rescue party was coming, and they were coming for blood. Lieutenant Steele's face went from confident to panicked in the span of a heartbeat. How long do we have? He demanded. Bear tilted his head, listening to the approaching thunder of hoofbeats. 5 minutes, maybe less. Damn it! Steele spun toward his men. Forget the search. Form a defensive perimeter around the cabin. Morrison, get the horses ready for a fighting retreat. But Bear was already moving, heading toward his cabin with purpose. Lieutenant, if you want to live through the next hour, you need to listen to me very carefully. Steele grabbed Bear's arm. Where do you think you're going? To save all our lives. Bear pulled free. That war party isn't coming to negotiate. They're coming because they think you killed Swift Eagle. The only way to stop a massacre is to prove them wrong. By harboring a murderer, by betraying my own, by finding out the truth. Bear's voice cut through Steele's protests. Something about your story doesn't add up, Lieutenant. That Comanche pouch, the way you're so eager to skip a proper trial, the fact that you're out here with just 10 men, chasing a supposedly dangerous killer. The sound of horses was getting closer. And now Bear could make out individual war cries carried on the wind. Steele's soldiers were setting up behind whatever cover they could find. But Bear could see the fear in their eyes. 10 men against a Comanche war party was suicide. What are you suggesting? Steele asked, though his hand was still on his gun. I'm suggesting that maybe Swift Eagle isn't the murderer you claim he is. Bear stepped closer. And I'm suggesting that when Running Wolf gets here, you better have a damn good explanation for why his son is bleeding to death in my bedroom. Steele's face went white. How did you— Because I'm not an idiot, Lieutenant. The boy rode here wounded and desperate, babbling about soldiers chasing him. You show up an hour later with a convenient story about murdered escorts and stolen medicine. Bear gestured toward the approaching war party. Does that sound like the response to a simple crime? Or does it sound like a father who thinks his son was ambushed? Morrison appeared at Steele's shoulder. Lieutenant, we've got riders coming from 3 directions. Looks like they're trying to surround us. Bear felt a chill run down his spine. If the Comanche had split into multiple groups, this wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a coordinated military operation. That meant White Bull himself was involved. And it meant the situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. There's something you're not telling me, Bear said to Steele. What really happened this morning? Steele's jaw worked silently for a moment, and Bear could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. Finally, the lieutenant spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We weren't escorting a supply wagon. We were escorting a surveyor. Bear's blood went cold. A surveyor. Government man sent to map out reservation boundaries. The Comanche weren't supposed to know about it. Steele's confidence was completely gone now, replaced by something that looked like shame. Swift Eagle caught us marking trees near their sacred grounds. He tried to stop us, and you shot him for defending his people's holy land. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Steele's voice cracked. The surveyor panicked, started shooting. Swift Eagle fought back in self-defense. He killed the surveyor and one of my men before we could stop him. The truth hit Bear like a physical blow. Swift Eagle wasn't a murderer. He was a young warrior who had stumbled onto a government conspiracy to steal more Comanche land. The murdered soldiers were casualties of an illegal surveying operation that never should have happened. If you were Bear, what would you do? Turn Swift Eagle over to soldiers who had already proven they'd kill to cover up their crimes? Or stand with a wounded 19-year-old against 10 armed cavalry men with a war party bearing down on everyone? Tell us in the comments on Narrative Sphere. We need to know which side you choose, because what Bear decided next would determine whether the sun set on justice or on the biggest Indian war Texas had ever seen. The war party crested the ridge at that moment. 30 Comanche warriors in full battle regalia, led by a man Bear recognized as Running Wolf. Behind them came another group from the east, and Bear could see dust clouds indicating a third group approaching from the south. Too late for truth now, Steele muttered, raising his rifle. But Bear was already stepping between the soldiers and the approaching warriors, his hands raised high in the universal gesture of peace. What he was about to do would either prevent a war or start one, and he had about 30 seconds to figure out which. Running Wolf's war party thundered to a halt, 50 yards from Bear's cabin, their horses snorting and stamping with barely contained energy. The warrior who had fathered Swift Eagle sat tall on his painted stallion, his face streaked with black war paint, and his eyes burning with the kind of rage that comes from a parent who believes his child is dead. Behind Bear, he could hear Steele's soldiers checking their weapons, the metallic clicks of rifles being cocked mixing with nervous whispers. The tension was so thick, it felt like breathing smoke. Running Wolf spoke in Comanche, his voice carrying across the yard like thunder. Bear didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. Where is my son? Bear took 3 steps forward, placing himself directly between the 2 armed groups. Running Wolf, he called out in English, hoping the warrior would understand. Your son is alive. The effect was immediate. Running Wolf's expression shifted from fury to desperate hope, while behind Bear, Lieutenant Steele cursed under his breath. "You fool," Steele hissed. "You just signed our death warrants." But Bear ignored him, focusing entirely on Running Wolf. Swift Eagle is wounded, but he's breathing. "He's in my cabin." Running Wolf dismounted and began walking toward Bear, his hand resting on his tomahawk. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear. "Soldiers say he killed their brothers. Soldiers say he stole from children." The soldiers lied, Bear said simply. The words hung in the air like gunpowder, waiting for a spark. Behind Bear, he heard Steele take a sharp breath and the sound of rifles being raised. From the Comanche side came angry murmurs as Running Wolf translated Bear's words for the other warriors. "That's enough," Steele shouted, stepping forward with his rifle aimed at Bear's back. "I won't stand here and listen to this savage sympathizer." Running Wolf's tomahawk was in his hand and cocked back to throw before Steele could finish the sentence. The other Comanche warriors raised their weapons in response, and Bear found himself in the middle of 30 arrows and 10 rifles, all pointed at each other. "Stop!" Bear shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Nobody moves. Nobody shoots. Not until you hear the truth." "The truth?" came a new voice from the direction of the cabin. "Is that these soldiers are murderers and thieves." Everyone turned to see Swift Eagle standing in Bear's doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, but very much alive. His shirt was gone, replaced by crude bandages, and his face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were clear and angry. Swift Eagle spoke rapidly in Comanche to his father, gesturing toward the soldiers, and then toward the hills where the surveying had taken place. Bear watched Runnings Wolf's face grow darker with each word until the warrior's expression was like a storm about to break. "He says," Running Wolf translated for Bear's benefit, "that these soldiers were cutting marks into sacred trees, marking our burial grounds for white men to steal." Lieutenant Steele's face went ashen. "That's not," he says. Running Wolf continued. "The white surveyor shot first when Swift Eagle tried to stop them. He says my son fought only to protect the graves of our ancestors." Running Wolf's voice was deadly quiet now. "He says these soldiers are here to silence him, so their crime stays hidden." Bear felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. This wasn't about justice or law or even murder. This was about a government land grab gone wrong, and Swift Eagle was the only witness who could expose it. "Is that true, Lieutenant?" Bear asked, though he already knew the answer. Steele's silence was answer enough. Running Wolf raised his tomahawk and let out a war cry that chilled Bear's blood. The other Comanche warriors echoed the call, and Bear realized that in the next few seconds, his ranch was going to become a battlefield where everyone died, unless he could think of something that would satisfy both justice and mercy. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to Narrative Sphere. That's when Bear made the most dangerous gamble of his life. "Running Wolf!" Bear shouted, his voice cutting through the war cries. "By the law of your own people, you cannot kill these men on neutral ground." The Comanche warrior froze, his tomahawk still raised high. Every eye in the yard was now fixed on Bear, who was gambling everything on his incomplete understanding of tribal law. This ranch was declared neutral by Chief White Bull himself. Bear continued, praying he was getting this right. "No blood can be spilled here without his permission. To break that law would bring dishonor to your tribe." Running Wolf lowered his weapon slowly, his face twisted with internal conflict. Bear could see the war between a father's rage and a warrior's duty playing out in the man's eyes. Swift Eagle spoke again from the doorway, his voice weak but urgent. Running Wolf listened, then turned back to Bear with something that might have been respect. "My son says you saved his life knowing it would cost you yours. He says you have honored the old ways." Running Wolf gestured toward Lieutenant Steele. "But these soldiers have committed crimes that cannot go unpunished." Then let's make sure they're punished properly. Bear said. According to the law, not by war, Lieutenant Steele stepped forward, desperation making him bold. You can't seriously be considering turning American soldiers over to savages. We have rights. You had rights, Bear interrupted coldly, until you decided to murder witnesses and steal sacred land. He turned back to Running Wolf. What does Comanche law say about men who desecrate burial grounds? Running Wolf's smile was sharp as a blade. They faced trial by combat, one warrior against each man who profaned the sacred places. Bear felt his stomach drop. Trial by combat meant certain death for the soldiers. No cavalryman could match a Comanche warrior in single combat. But before he could object, Sergeant Morrison stepped forward. Lieutenant Steele, Morrison said quietly, maybe it's time to tell the whole truth. Steele spun on his subordinate. Sergeant, I order you to what? To keep covering up your crimes. Morrison's voice was steady, but full of disgust. Sir, I've been following your orders for 6 months, watching you take bribes from surveyors and land speculators. But I won't watch you start a war to cover it up. The revelation hit the yard like a lightning strike. Bear stared at Morrison in shock, while Running Wolf's warriors began murmuring among themselves. How long has this been going on? Bear asked. Morrison kept his eyes fixed on Steele as he answered. Since last spring, Lieutenant Steele's been taking money from government surveyors, giving them military escorts into Indian Territory so they can map out land that's supposed to be protected by treaty. That's treason, Bear breathed. It's worse than treason, Morrison continued. 3 weeks ago, a surveyor's crew got caught by a Kiowa hunting party. Steele ordered us to tell the families that the men died in an Apache raid. The truth is, we left them to die, rather than risk exposing the surveying operation. Running Wolf didn't need a translation to understand the implications. His face had gone from angry to something far more dangerous. Cold, calculating fury. Swift Eagle called out weakly from the doorway, speaking in Comanche. His father's expression grew even darker as he listened. My son says, there are many white men's marks on the sacred trees. He says they have been cutting symbols into our ancestors' graves for months. Running Wolf's voice was like ice. How many of our sacred places have been defiled? Morrison looked at Steele, who had gone completely pale. When the lieutenant didn't answer, Morrison spoke instead. At least a dozen sites, maybe more. The plan was to document every valuable piece of Indian territory, so the government could renegotiate the treaties. Bear felt sick. This wasn't just about stealing land. It was about systematically destroying everything the Comanche held sacred to make that theft easier. There's something else, Morrison added reluctantly. The surveyor who died this morning, he wasn't just mapping burial grounds. He was looking for something specific. What? Bear demanded. Morrison glanced at Running Wolf, then back at Bear. Gold! There's been rumors of gold deposits in the Sacred Hills. The government wants to know if the rumors are true before they force the tribes to relocate. The silence that followed was deafening. Bear could see Running Wolf processing this information, could see the exact moment when the warrior realized the full scope of the betrayal his people faced. When Running Wolf finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute judgment. Then it is not just these soldiers who must face justice. It is everyone who sent them. Bear's blood went cold as he realized what the warrior meant. This wasn't going to end with a trial by combat, or even with Steele's death. Running Wolf was talking about war, real war, against every government official and land speculator who had been part of the conspiracy, and Bear was standing right in the middle of it, with no idea how to stop what was coming. Bear could see the wheels of war turning in Running Wolf's mind, and he knew he had seconds to prevent a conflict that would consume the entire territory. But it was Swift Eagle who spoke first, his weak voice somehow carrying across the tense silence. Father, the young warrior said in English, clearly intending for everyone to understand. The white man bear, he broke sacred law to save my life. Running Wolf's attention snapped back to his son. Swift Eagle was leaning heavily against the door frame, but his eyes were clear and determined. When I told him that helping me would force you to kill him, he helped me anyway. Swift Eagle continued. He chose my life over his own safety. That is the action of a true warrior. Bear felt his throat tighten. He'd forgotten about the sacred law Swift Eagle had mentioned, the one that would require Running Wolf to kill anyone who interfered in tribal justice, even if their intentions were good. The law is clear, Running Wolf said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Any white man who aids a Comanche warrior facing tribal punishment must face the same punishment himself. But I wasn't facing tribal punishment, Swift Eagle replied. I was facing white man's injustice. Bear saved me from false accusations and certain death. The young warrior pushed himself away from the doorframe, standing straighter despite his wounds. By the old laws, that makes him worthy of protection, not punishment. Lieutenant Steele chose that moment to make his move. While everyone's attention was focused on the exchange between father and son, he slowly raised his rifle toward Swift Eagle. But Sergeant Morrison saw the movement and acted without hesitation. He tackled his commanding officer, sending both men tumbling to the ground in a cloud of dust. Sir, you're under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and conduct unbecoming an officer, Morrison announced as he pinned Steele to the ground. The other soldiers looked at each other uncertainly, but none of them moved to help their lieutenant. Bear realized that Morrison's confession had been building for months, and the other men were as disgusted with Steele's crimes as their sergeant was. Running Wolf watched this display of white man's justice with obvious approval. It seems not all soldiers are without honor, he said to Bear. Most aren't, Bear replied. Steele was using his authority to line his own pockets. The other men were just following orders they thought were legal. Swift Eagle spoke again in Comanche, his words urgent and passionate. Running Wolf listened carefully, then nodded slowly. My son proposes something that has never been done before. Running Wolf translated. He wants to offer the guilty soldiers a choice. Face trial by combat according to our laws, or face trial by white man's justice, with Comanche witnesses to ensure fairness. Bear blinked in surprise. It was actually a brilliant compromise. It would satisfy the tribe's need for justice, while preventing the cycle of violence that would inevitably follow executions. But Steele wasn't finished causing trouble. As Morrison tried to secure his hands, the lieutenant broke free and lunged for his fallen rifle, clearly intending to shoot Swift Eagle and eliminate the key witness to his crimes. Running Wolf's tomahawk was already spinning through the air before Bear could react. The weapon struck Steele in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground with a scream of pain. Now he faces trial by combat, whether he wants it or not. Running Wolf said calmly, retrieving his tomahawk. The penalty for trying to kill my son is death. Bear looked at the wounded lieutenant, writhing in the dirt, then at the circle of Comanche warriors who had moved closer to watch the final act of justice unfold. Steele was finished. Even if he survived trial by combat, his career was over and his crimes exposed. But Bear realized there was still one more problem to solve. The government conspiracy that Steele had been part of was bigger than one corrupt officer. The surveyors, the land speculators, the officials who had ordered the illegal mapping, they were all still out there, still planning to steal Comanche land. And now they knew that their secret was compromised. The trial by combat was over in less than 3 minutes. Lieutenant Steele, wounded and desperate, had no chance against the Comanche warrior Running Wolf chose as his champion. But as Steele breathed his last in Bear's yard, the real consequences of the day's events were just beginning to unfold. Sergeant Morrison gathered his remaining men and prepared to ride back to the fort with news of Steele's death and a full report on the illegal surveying operation. But Bear knew that wouldn't be enough to stop what was coming. "Morrison!" Bear called out as the sergeant mounted his horse. "When you get back to Colonel Harrison, you tell him exactly what happened here. You tell him that the Comanche have evidence of government treaty violations, and they're not going to stay quiet about it." Morrison nodded grimly. "I'll tell him, Mr. Mallister, but I can't promise he'll listen. There's a lot of money involved in those land deals." As the soldiers rode away, Bear found himself alone with 30 Comanche warriors, and the growing realization that he'd just become the most important white man in Texas, whether he wanted to be or not. Running Wolf approached Bear, his expression serious but no longer hostile. "You have done something today that will be remembered for generations," the warrior said. "You chose truth over safety, justice over profit." "I just did what was right," Bear replied. "That is exactly why you must do more." Running Wolf gestured toward his son, who was being helped onto a horse by 2 of the younger warriors. "Swift Eagle will live because of your courage, but our sacred places are still threatened. Our people still face lies and theft from your government." Bear understood what Running Wolf was asking. "You want me to be a witness, to testify about what I saw here today. More than that, we want you to be a bridge between our peoples, as you were 6 months ago, with Chief White Bull's daughter." Running Wolf's voice carried the weight of desperate hope. "The white authorities will not listen to Comanche accusations, but they might listen to a white rancher who saw their crimes with his own eyes." Bear looked around at the faces of the warriors surrounding him, men who had come here, ready for war, but were now asking for his help in preventing one. He thought about the surveyors still marking sacred trees, the government officials still planning to steal treaty-protected land, the cycle of violence and betrayal that seemed to define relations between their peoples. "What do you need me to do?" Bear asked. Running Wolf smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Bear had seen from him all day. "We need you to ride to the territorial capital. We need you to tell the governor what you witnessed, and we need you to carry proof that even white authorities cannot ignore." One of the warriors brought forward a leather pouch, the same one Lieutenant Steele had claimed contained a dead soldier's personal effects. Running Wolf opened it and dumped the contents onto the ground. Instead of letters and photographs, dozens of surveyors' markers spilled out, small metal tags marked with government codes and GPS coordinates. Steele wasn't just protecting a land grab, Bear realized. He was coordinating it. Every sacred site that has been violated, every treaty boundary that has been crossed. It is all documented here. Running Wolf picked up one of the markers. "This is proof that your government has been planning to steal our land for months." Bear stared at the markers, understanding the full scope of what he was looking at. This wasn't just corruption. It was a systematic campaign to void every treaty the government had signed with the tribes. "If I take this to the governor, it'll mean investigations, trials, maybe even congressional hearings," Bear said. "And if you do not take it," Running Wolf replied, "it will mean war, not just between our tribes and the cavalry, but between every Indian nation in Texas and your government." Bear picked up the leather pouch and began collecting the surveyor's markers. Each piece of metal represented sacred ground that had been violated, promises that had been broken, trust that had been betrayed. But they also represented something else, the possibility of justice. 3 weeks later, Bear stood in the governor's office in Austin, presenting evidence that would lead to the largest investigation of government corruption in Texas history. 17 officials were eventually prosecuted. The illegal surveying operation was shut down, and new treaties were negotiated that actually protected tribal lands. Swift Eagle recovered fully from his wounds and became a respected leader in his tribe. often serving as a translator and negotiator in disputes between Comanche and settlers. Running Wolf lived to see his grandchildren grow up on land that remained free from white encroachment. Bear's Ranch continued to serve as neutral ground, but now it also became something more. A place where two very different peoples learned that justice and mercy could coexist, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with the courage to tell the truth. And every year, on the anniversary of that October day, Bear would find a single eagle feather left on his doorstep, a reminder that some friendships are forged in moments of impossible choice, and that the best of humanity emerges when ordinary people decide to do extraordinary things. If you're loving these incredible true stories from the Old West, subscribe to Narrative Sphere and click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon.